Much. Thanks, sir. It was very interesting. I'd like to call on Stephen Price. We share a namesake, which was very beneficial to me as a medical student. Steve's father was the late professor of law at UCT. When we went in alphabetical order, I used to go in first, and they would say, "Oh, look, he's Tom Price's son. We better give him a high mark." It was always a disappointment because when you used to go to these result boards and I'd see Price be 86%, and then I'd see Price 60%, and then I realised he'd got 80%, I'd got 60%. Steve?
I'll give you another little story about Bernie and me. I'm not sure whether this it might have been invented by technologists, or I don't think it was invented by the student class, but we did pathology together. Remember, you came and did your primaries in the pathology department, and the technologist took one look at us, and he looked at Bernie, he looked at me, and my weight used to fluctuate, and sometimes I got very large. So they called us half price and full price. Okay, now I hope I can get through this. I'm afraid I'm going to read it, because if I ad-lib, we'll be here till 5 o'clock tonight. So I'm going to read it. I hope it doesn't sound too boring. I've entitled this A Busman's Holiday. After our previous talks, reaching the heights of philosophy with skepticism and momentous events of World War II, I'm afraid my story is a bit more mundane, and it's to do with back jobs and part-time jobs we were given at UCT when we were students. And my talk centers on recalling 2 such jobs I had, which were during our medical school years. The first was a part-time job in 1971, which was our 5th year, the year which, amongst a variety of courses, you remember we did the dreaded chemical pathology. My mum was a librarian working in the law library in Heading Hall in the Orange Street UCT campus. She wangled me a late afternoon evening job slot in her library, and besides being the law library, this covered part-time students who worked in town and had their lectures in the afternoon, evening at the Heading campus. I think a few of these students registered for half-course business science so they could play rugby for Ikeys. My mum only got the job because she was pretty destitute after my dad died. My dad was a prophet in the law faculty and died relatively young, at the age of 51. And that was in 1966, while I was in the army, aged 18. My dad had had a subarachnoid hemorrhage, aged about 48, and finally succumbed 3 years later to a stroke. Prof. Stuart Saunders then was my dad's deputy warden at University House, and was also my dad's attending physician. And I can credit the then Dr. Saunders with my very first medical lesson. I remember when my dad died, I was called home, and there everybody was there, including Stuart Saunders, comforting my mother. And then I said to them, I want to go and see my dad. And I remember him following me into my dad's room, perhaps a bit worried I might faint at the sight of him lying dead, and looking down at him very philosophically and saying to me with a thoughtful look on his face, "Your dad died of a massive intracranial hemorrhage," my very first medical lesson. And I remember that actually dying of a stroke after a subarachnoid hemorrhage was a fairly common thing, and often you could appear to have a miraculous recovery from a subarachnoid, but unfortunately you could die at any time. Anyway, from 3rd year on, I always wondered whether I perhaps had a couple of berry aneurysms too, and I might be struck down in the same way. But so far, I seem to have escaped miraculously. Also, my dad, who smoked about 20 a day and drank heavily, forewarned me of some of the other things which can play a role. I have to mention at this point that in the 50s and 60s, academics were paid virtually nothing, much worse than they are now, which I suppose began the tradition in our teaching that doctors should kill themselves for the good of the profession and for mankind, and not soil themselves with money matters. So an early unexpected death in our family was a disaster. But UCT did its best, allowing me a bursary to study medicine, and it gave my mom a special dispensation to qualify as a librarian. My mum actually had left school at 14. She went to a school in a town called Ashbourne in England, and its main claim to fame was that there was a special type of football, a precursor of rugby, played there on Shrove Tuesday, which is the first Tuesday of Lent, or first day of Lent, and where you traditionally let your hair down and ate, and it was also called Pancake Day. Anyway, this rugby football was played in this town between two mill wheels in the river, and it was really a mud wrestling match. And the uptown played the downtown, and not often was a goal scored, of course, because the goals were 2 miles apart. And in fact, every now and again did someone manage to score a goal. Anyway, my mum went to famous Ashbourne Grammar School, and it must have provided her with a good education, because even though she didn't have a matric or anything, when she did her English courses for a librarianship diploma, courtesy of UCT, she got first for all her English. My job, of course, required no qualification. I stamped the books in and out of the library and chatted to the students in the evening, and I got a lift home with a library attendant whose name I forget, let's call him Daniel. And I remember Daniel, who was coloured and understandably incensed about apartheid and some of the atrocities at that time, such as group areas, removals, and so on. He would harangue me all the way from UCT Library in Orange Street until he dropped me off in Mowbray about the evils of apartheid. At that time, in medical school, the animal house was being rebuilt, and there was some demolition work going down. I remember they had a massive wrecking ball on the end of a crane, and the crane would bang into the wall, and this would often happen when we had chem path lectures. So our chem path lectures would be interrupted with this booming sound of the wrecking ball going into the animal house next door. One day it had been raining, and I remember suddenly there was a massive boom, much louder than all the rest, and all the windows shook. And so the immediate assumption was that the wrecking ball must have knocked down a whole wall or something. However, it later transpired fairly quickly that what had actually happened, that 3 SA Air Force planes flying in close formation had flown into the side of Devil's Peak behind us, above the animal paddock, which is obviously above GSH and UCT. And the planes, which were medium size, contained quite a few SAA brass and had been practicing for an air display to mark Republic Day. And later on there was an inquiry. The planes, apparently, although it was 1971, were using visual navigation. And they were meant to be following the line of a road somewhere near the M5 Black River Parkway, which goes past Red Cross Children's Hospital. But the front lead pilot became totally confused, and he was following Rhodes Drive and then Duval Drive. So what happened is he turned the corner in complete cloud with no radar or anything. They flew straight into the side of Devil's Peak. And that was the big boom we'd heard. I worked later that day as the news of the shockingly gruesome aircraft crash filtered through in the early evening and the editions of the Cape Argus. And I clearly remember Daniel, our library attendant, on the way home, haranguing me in absolute conviction that the reason for the crash was God's retribution against apartheid, and that's why it had happened. And this was a sign that apartheid was going to come to an end. However, poor Daniel had to wait another 20 years for that. This job went on for months, and I earned just enough pay for a passage on the lower decks of a cruise to South America over Christmas and New Year 1971, which you might remember was the final school holidays before we started our final year medicine. I suppose most conscientious students were preparing themselves for the final slog of the final year, it's medical training. However, I'll warrant that my choice was probably more of an education, and that the proper learning of medicine probably only really began in our house years. A more notorious boat going to South America at that time, you might remember, was the Reina del Mar. It was a Union Castle boat. It was a notorious booze cruise over Christmas. But I went on a P&O boat. It was called the Chusan. And it had a lovely yellow funnel and a white superstructure and hull. And I remember the superstructure was cut away, sort of tropical style. My tropical dreams took a bit of a dive when I discovered that I'd booked on an inboard cabin on or below the waterline, and I was sharing a cabin with two other guys who happened to be German and gay. My worries were alleviated when they hastily explained to me that they were not partners and that their relationship was entirely platonic. The younger of the two clearly had dreams of romantic gay encounters in Rio and Buenos Aires. The older, probably in his late 50s, proceeded to explain to me very seriously that he was induced to become gay because in his younger days he had been a mere boy in the Hitler Youth movement in Germany, and he engaged in sexual acts because he needed to earn money for his family who was starving as the Russians and Allied troops advanced towards Berlin. Anyway, my 2 and a bit weeks with my fellow passengers certainly opened my innocent eyes to the gay world. For example, in Rio, they would disappear for the day and then regale me with their romantic encounters. One involved the day cruising Rio Bay on a luxury yacht in one uproarious gay party, which included the Archbishop of Rio de Janeiro, I think probably a cardinal, and which increased my naive understanding in that it was for the first time apparent to me that the gay world extended into every nook and cranny. Of course, this is obvious to us today, but then perhaps not so obvious. In Buenos Aires, the younger of my 2 companions would be walking with one and then suddenly disappear, and subsequently reappear, gushing with excitement about the wonderful young gay man he had just met and made an arrangement to meet in a nightclub that night. Rio was also a wild, wild place, and humming with humid summer evenings with preparations for the carnival, with the samba schools to brush up on the street dancing. The driving was absolutely insane, probably worse than Cape Town. The favelas looked exactly like Khayelitsha, exactly the same. Township on the sides of Corcovado Mountain. You went through it in the funicular railway. And to cap it all, our guide announced rather sort of laconically, there's this sort of life is cheap atmosphere there. They said that 2 months before we arrived, the funicular railway going up the Corcovado Mountain had come to a dead stop. Then it rolled back into the station at the bottom again, and 2 people had got killed. However, one soon learned to forget about these possible dangers and take life as it came. The place was massively humid, leaving me feeling like a melting ice sucker. And when we came back to the boat of an evening, there was a wonderful wall of air-conditioned air as one walked into the boat. One night we had arranged to go to a nightclub which provided a magnificent show of South American drumming, which was absolutely mesmerizing, I remember. I was rather anxious that we might land up in a dive and perhaps get mugged and not have enough money to get home. So I proceeded to put a couple of banknotes in my shoe. There was no violence or mugging, and we got home. And when I took my shoe off, it was obviously a waste of time because the notes were consistency of tissue paper, and they'd all become multiple worthless fragments. The experience of South America, Rio with its idyllic scenery and landmarks such as the Christ statue atop the Corcovado, the sugar loaf, the romantic beaches such as Ipanema. In other parts of Brazil, Santos, the port of Sao Paulo itself, Argentina and Buenos Aires in Argentina, and Montevideo in Uruguay, plus Christmas, New Year, and wild, wild scenes on the boat were well worth the expense, and I'll warrant more of an education for me than slogging in medicine before first year. At the end of the piece, we stopped off and anchored briefly next to Tristan da Cunha, a little island in the middle of the Atlantic, you recall. And I recall seeing the island as houses clustered beneath the massif of the volcano. Okay, so that's the first job. Here's the second. This was a job which took place in the end of our second year, which is our year of anatomy and physiology, when I was a raw 19 going on 20-year-old, and I signed on for a few weeks to be a bus conductor for the city tramways. The tramways operated from a large building in Woodstock Main Road called the Tollgate Depot. Some of you may recall the so-called Tollgate scandal, when some scoundrels took over the Tollgate tramways, and while living a life of ease, for example, doing things like taking a long weekend trip to Scotland to do grouse shooting, that's leaving on Friday and coming back Monday, they allowed the City of Tramways company to go to rack and ruin. And that led to a complete loss of the bus service in Cape Town. That affected all the buses coming from out in the Atlantic seaboard, coming on the southern suburbs, and even out onto the flats. To this, we might add today that the ANC has continued the breakdown of public transport with our railways collapsing. And then this has made us rather dependent on our taxi service. Now the taxi service regards all forms of other transport as competition and does things like burns trains and so on. And anyway, slowly our public transport is recovering with a few more buses, but for years and years we've had no public transport, and this has led to hardship for many of those who don't possess a car. And so perhaps we should think, this is the problem of South Africa and its troubles, and explains it neatly, that corruption extends across all sections of our society, some of which should not just point fingers at the others, but think a little more, because the downfall of public transport in this city began with the Tollgate scandal. Okay, a bit more about the job. As student bus conductors, we were clothed in drab tramways uniform of a military-style dull khaki brown, with cloth blazer, a sort of grey-blue shirt, baggy pants, and military-style cap. Our equipment was ancient, with a satchel containing books of paper tickets, a punch, and some space for banknotes. And we also had a contraption around us which is shaped a bit like a set of pan pipes, a whole lot of parallel cylinders which contained all the different coin denominations. And you could slot a coin in at one end and press a lever and it would come out the other. This is all totally archaic to us in a world of plastic cards, and that we should actually deal with cash in that way. Our conductor job involved selling tickets for which one had to work out the fare using a quite complex system of bus stops and stages. Also controlling the entry and exit of passengers from the bus and ringing the driver to announce when it's time for the bus to go. And the third thing was sort of unofficial job of being the butt of every Tom, Dick, and Harry's grumpiness on the rush hour morning into town. You just had to take that. For this today, I have an immense respect for blue-collar workers, then and now, who put up with these conditions of employment year in and year out. For me, my 3 weeks was all about a bit of pocket money, and I had the luxury of returning to my cozy middle-class existence, because I was working for fun and a bit of money and not desperately trying to make a living. Take the ticket dispensing, for example. On the main road route from the city to Wynberg to Retreat and back, there might be something like 100 bus stops. And these, for some crazy reason, were divided into stages. They were grouped in stages, not a nice round figure like 10, but it could be 7, 8, or 9 would comprise a stage. And you had to work out whether a passenger got on one stage or another, and where they might get off on the future. Was another stage. So you had to be aware what stage your bus was in, and quite frankly, it's a pretty insane way to work out a bus fare. Another thing the efficient conductor had to do was to preserve the cash float. Because in the morning rush hour, when a 100 Rand note for 20-cent fare could run you out of cash straight away, it was no good trying to bum cash off other passengers. At the other end of the day, you had to do the other thing. You had to get rid of your cash as fast as you can and take in as many banknotes as you could, or else you'd have to spend 45 minutes in front of an irate cashier as you counted out many coins. And the old pro conductors who'd been doing it for years seemed to make very light work of that. They managed to toss a few banknotes across the cashier, have just about no cash to count, and were in and out of the cashier's office in a flash, probably heading for a drink or two before they went home. Policing the best bus conductors were the inspectors, who could get on the bus at any time and check whether or not one had a ticket. Again, missing a fare was quite easy to do because tickets weren't purchased at the entry door, but relied on the conductor tracking a new passenger to their seat, hopefully extracting the correct fare. All the while seeing to the safety of passengers and communicating with the driver. The inspectors loved to catch out and intimidate the little rich boy student conductors. I remember one who loved being on my case, shoving his face virtually into mine and saying, "Watch out for me, sonny boy. My name is Ulrich. Remember me, Ulrich with the dark glasses." Anyway, Ulrich did manage to catch me out one rush hour morning with the bus riding through the streets of Windermere. Windermere, you might remember, is where today's Maitland and Kensington is now. The bus was a beat-up old London bus, a motorised double-decker with a completely open back door and a pole to grab onto, but no pneumatic doors. The bus was packed with people standing upstairs, not allowed today, but in those days of apartheid, unfortunately, however empty the downstairs seats were, people of colour would have to stand upstairs. So I was busy sweating, trying to do fares up there and trying to look at keep in contact with the bus driver. You had to look through a series of mirrors to see what was going on downstairs. If you rang the bell too early, somebody might get killed, or if your bus departed before they were on, it could be very dangerous. So it was quite tricky. Anyway, in the midst of all of this, Ulrich of the cool shades had sneaked onto the bus unnoticed by me, and he managed to unearth a little old lady at the front of the top deck whose fare I'd missed. Fortunately, he didn't seem to want to scale me out, but he just was really pleased he'd managed to catch out one of the little rich kid student conductors. As the days progressed, one became aware of the tricks of the trade. One ruse involved in the tollgate depot Kirstenbosch service, where two buses left tollgate simultaneously. One would go the lower main road and one would go the upper main road. And the trick was to get in the bus behind, particularly before they joined again. You remember the lower main road and the upper main road joined together just below medical school here on the edge of Mowbray Observatory. And so if you had a good bus driver, he would leave slightly after the other guy, and he would hang back the whole way on his particular route. And it was sort of like a game of dice. You know, you'd go as slow as possible just to make sure the other bus got in front. And the reason for that is if you got behind, then the other bus would have to do all the work. And the guy would hang behind, he wouldn't pass him, he would just sit behind. Your bus would be empty and their bus would be crammed full of passengers. So you would lean over the bar and chat and have a good time and do no work. Sorry. On the Saturday of the last weekend, before my job ended, I was on a route on the Atlantic seaboard in a single-decker bus. We were travelling from the city through Green and Sea Points along Main Road, Victoria Drive to Clifton, and then Camps Bay. And then we'd pause for a while before returning along the upper route, which would be Kloof Road, and then down onto Sea Point Main Road again. And I noticed that the driver was going quite fast. And then I became a little bit concerned because every time we turned around in Camps Bay, he would reach into his pocket and take out a silver hip flask and take a couple of swigs, 2 or 3 swigs. So we were going around pretty fast, you know. So at about 11 p.m., it was raining hard, and there were only 2 passengers in the bus. And I remember we were going along above Clifton where there's quite a steep drop, and the bus driver was really sending it. And I became a little alarmed, but I thought, to hell, I'm tired. I'd been on a double shift since 5 a.m., and I really was going to be out of this job tomorrow, so I wasn't worried. Then we came to the part going where it winds down to Sea Point Main Road, and he was still caning it in that bus. And I was sort of half asleep in the back seat. There were 2 other passengers, young ladies out for the night. I remember nobody else in the bus. And there we would go, caning it down to Sea Point Main Road in this bus in the rain. Suddenly I was in a sort of surreal dream, and the bus lurched from side to side. I fancy we might have glanced off a car coming up. Suddenly the bus took an absolute left turn, left the road. It went through a hedge and a fence. We took a few electricity poles with us. I know they were electricity because as we went through, the wires snapped and there were flashes of, from the electricity. And the bus came to rest. Fortunately, we'd gone past the steep drop to Clifton. There was only a small drop down to the road below, and we went into somebody's garden, and the front wheels down, and the back of the bus in the air with its wheels off the ground. I shot awake. The young ladies were screaming hysterically, and we all managed to get to the front entrance with no one hurt, to find the bus driver stunned and slumped over the wheel. He might have been partly inebriated, I'm not sure. It was difficult to tell, but he was unable to pull the lever to open the pneumatic door in the front, and then the 2 ladies became even more hysterical because it seemed we were trapped in the bus. But I fortunately managed to find the lever, gave it a tug, and the doors open. And we tumbled out into an even more surreal scene. There were big pools of water and live electricity wires dangling it, and flashes of electricity. And I thought, well, we survived the crash. We might just electrocute ourselves. We walk in the water or something. Anyway, within a few minutes, there was a massive crowd around the bus. And but after a while, it did dissipate. Things, sanity returned. The bus driver was carted off to hospital with a broken arm. The police came, and gradually the crowd dwindled. And then I realized I was virtually on my own. I mean, a few people were moaning about the bus service and the terrible driving, and I was the only representative of the bus service, so they took it out on me. So then everywhere was gone, and I was left standing there, in my bus conductor's uniform, wet through, looking a bit like sad sack. And it was before the time of cell phones, and wonder how the hell I was going to get home. It's now about midnight. Eventually, tramways must have got a message from somewhere, and they sent a car to get me. And I was carted back to the tollgate depot, where I counted out my day's takings at about 1:30 a.m. in front of an irate cashier for the last time. And before trundling off to find my little Mini and going home for a good night's sleep. I was meant to come in next day, but I must confess, I thought, darn it, I'm not going back there. Anyway, there was a sequel to all this, which took place a couple of months later when I was summoned to a lawyer's office to give evidence about the accident. In the meantime, I had become rather sorry for the bus driver. He seemed a rather troubled fellow with a drink problem. I wondered perhaps if his humdrum dead-end job made him drink. I had no idea. But I came somewhat guilty that I only had to endure about 3 weeks of that and could return to my comfortable middle-class existence with a bit of cash in my pocket. But the driver, poor guy, was trapped in that work and probably had no alternative but to stick it out year after year. For this reason, when the lawyer began to question me about the accident, I became a little bit reticent, and I realized I probably held the poor bus driver's future in my hands. The lawyer, however, would have none of it. He said to me, "Look, Sonny, I've been doing this tramway accident cases for years." And at that time, I noted that there were files all over his office, each one representing a bus accident. He said, "I must tell you," the lawyer continued, "that there's not one case I've ever handled where the tramway company, usually the drivers, was not to blame. At this point, I climbed down and mentioned the hip flask and the frequent swigs, presumably of alcohol, though obviously I couldn't be sure, with somewhat mixed feelings. On the one hand, I had probably cost the driver his job and probably damaged my any future employment prospects. On the other hand, obviously, bus drivers can't be allowed to go around swigging furiously at alcohol while they work. However, the whole couple of weeks left me with an immense respect for blue-collar workers and the jobs they have to endure to make a living. And just as an observation, one might wonder what on earth I was doing these things instead of doing medicine in the VAC, I think I probably had a better education learning about blue-collar workers, going to South America on a cruise boat, learning about amazing world of gay people, which I had no idea. So I think perhaps I took the right choice, particularly in the final year job, and not actually going to Yanni Lowe's extra lectures or whatever it was.